and I'm just going to give it a little cue up.
The Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium presents Transforming Guyana. In each episode, Dr. Blackman and Dr. Lewis will tackle a different area of interest for transforming Guyana.
Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to Season 3. Yes, it is Season 3, Episode 1 of the Guyana Business Journal and Caribbean Policy Consortium webinar series, Transforming Guyana. I am Terrence Blackman, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York, and the founder of the Guyana Business Journal. And I ought to have been joined by Dr. David Lewis of the Caribbean Policy Consortium. Unfortunately, Dr. Lewis is otherwise engaged with the Caribbean Heritage Month events in Washington, D.C. He is at this very moment moderating the panel, and so I suppose I will fly solo today. As with all of these matters, it is always good to pause for a moment and to kind of just I'll take this opportunity to give some background on the Transforming Guyana series, its goals, and to kind of give a brief overview of today's webinar agenda and its broad importance. So the GBJ's vision is an aim to offer a transformative, pragmatic thought leadership to empower and to enrich Guyana and its people in sort of broadly three areas: improving economic, social, and security conditions, create more equitable and diverse opportunities for Guyanese, and enhancing inclusive democracy and ensuring sort of harmonious, resilient, flourishing Guyana, where every citizen benefits from its economic growth, regardless of background. The GBJ's vision is a Guyana that is stronger, more inclusive, and prosperous for all. And it is to this end that the series, Transforming Guyana, aims to sort of bridge the gap between experts and prominent voices from Guyana, the Caribbean, and the diaspora to discuss the sort of far-reaching impacts of Guyana's oil and gas development. We will at times challenge the conventional wisdom, but hopefully always offer a balanced and insightful look at the opportunities and the potential pitfalls ahead. Explore sort of innovative strategies to maximize the positive impacts of Guyana's oil revenue on her people and her future, while mitigating the risks that other countries have faced. So, in terms of setting up this program, I in my morning read of the newspaper, so I take a look at the New York Times every morning, and today's New York Times has on its front page an article about Nigeria, and it talks about Nigeria confronting its worst economic crisis in a generation. And permit me 2 minutes just to read 3 paragraphs from this as the kind of mitigating the risks that other countries have faced. And the article says that people in Africa's most populous nation are suffering as the price of food, fuel, and medicine have skyrocketed out of the reach for many. Skyrocketing inflation, a national currency in free fall, millions of people struggling to buy food. Only 2 years ago, Africa's biggest economy, Nigeria is projected to drop to fourth place this year. The pain is widespread. Unions strike to protest salaries of around $20 a month. People die in stampedes, desperate for 3 sacks of rice. Hospitals are overrun with women racked with spasms from calcium deficiencies. The crisis is largely believed to be rooted in two major changes implemented by the president elected 15 months ago: the partial removal of fuel subsidies and the floating of the currency, which together have caused major price rises. A nation of entrepreneurs, Nigeria has more than 2 million citizens who are skilled at managing tough circumstances without state services, without the services that the state usually provide. They generate their own electricity, they source their own water, they take up arms and defend their community from forces the armed forces cannot. They negotiate with kidnappers when the families are abducted. But right now, their resources or resourcefulness are being stretched to the limit. And I think this is part of what we're aiming at in thinking through the Transforming Guyana series more broadly, and in terms of today's kickoff program for season 3, i.e., starting here on June 12th and extending through next June. The goal is to perhaps have this conversation set the place for a national development plan that has some broad consensus, that has some broad buy-in, and it's hoped that the challenges that places like Nigeria have experienced, that we in Guyana can come to some place where we have some sustainable economic growth and diversification, where we're working really seriously on our education and human capital, where we're looking at things like our infrastructure and connectivity, where we're doing environmental sustainability and resilience very well, where our healthcare services and social services are working in some very real sense, where our governance and the institutional strengthening that's necessary is happening, and more broadly, where there is some sense of regional integration. And so to if you will, kind of bring this conversation to a head, I'm joined by the folks who I kind of euphemistically refer to as the wise elders, to give us a thought about what Guyana might look like, could look like 15 years from now in 2040. Note, it's just 15 years, so it's not so far away. But we can lose the game in 15 years if we don't. West Indies plays today, and we know that what we do in the power play is going to be important. And so I think what we do in these first overs here are going to be important. And broadly, I want to seek the guidance today of Dr. Vibert Cambridge, Dr. Ulrich Trotz, Dr. Ithwa Griffith, and Dr. Lear Matthews, folks whose voices on many of these issues have really been central. And I want us to take advantage of their being here today. I'm going to begin by saying, as in the past, we've done things where we've done kind of individual presentations for long periods of time. Today, I'm hoping that we can have a more organic conversation, but it will still be prompted by individuals. And so we'll keep everyone on the screen, and we'll try to go through the conversation in this manner. So let me begin by throwing to sort of Vibert the opening salve. Given your expertise in cultural studies and media, how do you envision Guyana, its development, the cultural landscape evolving by 2040? And broadly, what role do you see the culture and media playing in the successful implementation of a consensual national development plan?
Good morning. Yeah, thank you, Terence. Good morning, and let me also say good morning to Ulrich, Ivlo, and Lear. Good to see you guys again. And well, Terence, big question. I think a destination could be what we call a just and caring society. Um, throughout, our, throughout our history, we've seen all these forces for justice. We've seen also forces for caring. For example, yesterday I was looking at something by Gordon Mosley, and he asked the question, what threaten you as an old person, or so what concerns about aging in Guyanese society? And they listed a number of things, health access, a caring society, how we look after our old. So I think that that's a destination. And 15 years from now, 14 years from now, or 16 years from now, is really half of a generation. And when you look at our population demographics, about 36.9%, almost 37% of our population is currently over 35. So in 15, 16 years, those folks are going to be getting ready for pensions. And there are concerns in Guyana about the nature of pensions, the quantum of pension. So that is a consideration you should keep in mind. The demographics of the society as it progresses over the next 15 years. So you've asked me to comment on the cultural landscape. When one deals with the term culture, I'd like to give it a slightly larger definition other than the performing arts or the creative arts. Culture is how a people respond to the multidimensional and dynamic environment. The environment in which we are contains a number of forces which impact on the way we respond to each other, the way we imagine, the way we organize, the way we plan, the way we implement, and the way we care for each other. Looking at the general landscape in Guyana, we are conscious of polarizations. We are conscious of our creative sectors and their strengths. Language. There's something on Facebook now saying, "How you know if you're a Guyanese?" and drawing upon that creolese. The strength of what Peter Kempadu calls our root cultures, and when you look at how our root cultures responded to the environment over time, you see a certain number of commonalities. The way we cook, the pots we use, the flavors we put in our food. So we could go our celebrations, we could go through all of those things, our music, our dance, our sport. Today, we're hoping that tonight the West Indies, we will rally around the West Indies and we do some damage to who we are playing against. So sport, heritage, tourism, all of these things are on that landscape, and we could trace the presence of those things over long periods of time. So I'm doing this kind of long period review to give me some kind of impetus to move forward. So when you talk about the current media landscape, you've got to talk about what are the factors that are influencing the current media cultural environment, and and the potential implications for 16 years down the pike. Clearly, globalization is a factor. What we have in Guyana presently, I was in Guyana a few weeks ago, actually, and one saw the immediate impact of globalization. You go into Guyanese restaurants, particularly the new ones, and the cuisine, the food that they're serving you, tends to have not very Guyanese. There's not much Guyaneseness in the upscale restaurants. They're all bought into the international jet set taste, pastas and this and that. So globalization is going to have an impact on that. And the globalization is not only coming from our intersection or our relationship with the global economy. It is also about us, our own people. I think Guyana's tourism product is attractive to nostalgia. So you've got a lot of folks who are going back home. And you know, Guyanese, we have a tendency to pomposet. So many of us go home and we pomposet. And some of that pomposetting is responsible for the pushback you're feeling from certain sectors of society about the diaspora. So going forward, that's one of the things we've got to work out in terms of that globalization impact. The other thing we've got to look at is social media. You know, Guyana has deep penetration. Over 90% of Guyanese people have access to smartphones. And as a result of that, you've got a whole new community of communicators or commentators on the Guyanese experience. It's My Life, ARD. You know, you just look at them. And many of them are popular with large followings. Our educational system is going to have an impact on that. Now, one of the things I would see us doing is, you know, buying into the notion of continuity. And I give you by way an example in the area of culture. In 1972, Guyana did this pioneering thing with Carifesta. And one of the consequences of Carifesta was we had an opportunity to measure ourselves against our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean. And it was clear that as enthusiastic as we were short on some competencies. We were short on some skills. And as a result, the Institute for the Creative Arts was established. And we called upon the best we had at that time: Pilgrim in music, Seymour in literature, Cosby in theater, Doris Harper Wills, and our sister from Haiti in dance, etc., Lavinia Williams, etc. Comes 1992, a change in our politics, or a way of governance. And to a large extent, that institute died or went silent. It was resuscitated in 2012, which was almost like 72 to 2012. That's almost 40 years? 40 years later, the incumbent government says, you know, I think this is the way we should go. So I think we're taking too long for continuity, or we should enshrine continuity in our society, given the possibilities of cycles of change in governance or governments in Guyana. Having said that, our cultural life, which gives us our cultural confidence to imagine, to go brave, to be, you know, to have efficacy, individual and collective efficacy. We have to address issues of poverty, crime, race, you know, lack of awareness, etc. And so heading towards 2020, half a generation ahead, conscious of the fact that in our cultural life, there are many commonalities that we don't address because we tend to see differences. Hopefully, over the next 15 years, we could begin to build a culture of continuity. Now, how do you get to that position? I will speak to that a little bit later when we're talking about communication and the development process. In terms of the role of media and culture, media is a manifestation of our culture. Sometimes it is cheaper to import content. Remember back in the 70s, I was working on the national television project, and one of the government of that day, particularly the prime minister at that time, was very adamant that did not want to start television until we had the capacity to create our own content. Now, you look at media environment in Guyana today, over 60% of media content is pirated. So going forward, our media and our cultural expressions need to be participatory, needs to be anchored on a vision going forward. And I think it's that process that could help to create a realistic national development plan. So I just want to
No. I think you've essentially framed the conversation in the direction. I think the goal really is to, provide some kind of thinking around, what a broadly realistic national development plan should look like, taking into account the sort of broad contours of Guyana, our polarization, our creativity, the root cultures, you know, the how, in order to get to that just and caring society that you sort of set out as a goal, in some very real sense. I think you sort of kind of anticipated where I hoped our conversation would go, in thinking through, like, what is an inclusive participatory vision that allows for the shaping of a broad national development plan that has the kind of consensus that's necessary, so that there's the cultural buy-in, so that everyone knows, at least in theory, where we're going. At this point, it's clear to me, just in terms of preparing for this enterprise, that everyone is not clear about where we're going, and is not agreed that that's the place that we ought to be going. And perhaps in that context, I want to bring you in now, Ivla, to sort of say, well, okay, everyone is not clear about where we're going. There's not this broad consensus about how it ought to unfold. We see the bad examples, as I've just noted, of Nigeria. From your sort of academic and policy analysis perspective, what do you see as sort of key goals, objectives for a national development plan that you believe are sort of most critical for achieving the kind of thing that is necessary in, say, 15 years, 16 years from now?
Let me begin, Terence, by greeting the other old farts in the program. I think that's what you had in mind. Let's get a couple of the old farts and
let's get the wise
have a
men
conversation
to thought on this thing.
But I also want to congratulate you and David on a third episode. Stick to itivism is valuable, but sometimes you start a journey, you don't get to even half of the intended destination. So you should be applauded, David and the team, for enabling us to get to the point of having a third season, first episode of the third season. I like Vibert's notion of a destination being a just and caring society. But a conversation about a just and caring society, a conversation about a national development plan, has an implicit assumption, which I want to focus on. And that implicit assumption is that there is going to be, in 2040, a Guyana as we know it now. What I think is important to factor into this conversation, as part of the continuous education of our Guyanese and diaspora society elements, is that you can't have a national development plan if you don't have a national territory. And I think it's important to keep in the conversation continuously that Guyana faces an existential territorial threat. And if you don't have a Guyana of 83,000 square miles in 2040, it means nothing to have a national development plan for 2040 for Guyana. And so I want to use the opportunity, even if it's only one Guyanese minute, Terence, to remind us all that we are in a moment of an existential reality, what I call a threat from the West. In the world of education and the world of media, repetition for emphasis is considered a virtue. And so I want to repeat a couple of things that perhaps all of us already know. but remind our audience, remind our listeners, remind our viewers why it's important not to lose sight that we are victorious in keeping the Guyana we know as the Guyana we want for 2040. Venezuela has recently filed before the International Court of Justice a request to extend the timeline for them to argue their case. This case has been going on for almost 6 years. Twists and turns. The very Venezuela that said it did not accept the jurisdiction of the court came back and accepted sotto voce, came back and used the very rules of the court to file preliminary objection, which the court said no value to them. Now they've come back using the very rules of the court that they say they will not accept, to say, we need another 12 months. I commend the Guyana government for objecting to that additional request and say, 12 months to do what? You filed your counter memorial in April of this year. You had a lot of time to put in all your documents and the various volumes of your counter memorial why you think this executable belongs to you. And one of the things I'm hoping that we will continuously see in Guyana, which I'm saddened to say that I don't see us having right now, is a continuous public education about this issue. I took a bet a couple of months ago in a program where you've appeared a lot, Terence. Bet one of the MPs of Guyana. I said, if you put 12 Guyanese students in a room, give them 5 minutes to discuss the Essequibo, I bet you a case of Banks or a case of Sorrel, you wouldn't get an intelligent conversation about the issue. And that is partly our neglect as a nation. My first time in Venezuela in 1981, I couldn't understand for the first 2 days why we were hearing the national anthems played so frequently, until I started to move around and saw that in every opportunity, you had graphic images of La Zona de Reclamación. You have conversations in the schools, part of the curriculum about this Essequibo. Meanwhile, we have only episodically been educating our own people about this. We need to remind ourselves that the Essequibo is not just for people who are on the coast, a place that is far away over there. The Essequibo is 74% of Guyana. We're talking about a claim by Venezuela for 6 of Guyana's 10 regions, all of Region 1, all of Region 2, parts of Regions 3 and 7 and 8 and 9. We're talking about a Guyana where the fulcrum of its economic enterprise is in the Essequibo. The gold, the diamond, the manganese, the uranium, the oil, off and onshore. Many of us remember in our early youth the conversations about the Takatu Basin. That oil is still there onshore. So for me, it's important at every conversation about Guyana and its future for us to ask ourselves, what do we know of the present Guyana? And what do we know of the territory being claimed? A territory that is so significant to the contemporary realities and to the future possibilities of Guyana. So for me, I think there's an assumption that is implicit in the conversation that we need to not let simply be implicit. We need to talk about it. We need to remind, we need to continue to educate our folks and ourselves about it. And that is this existential threat to our nation. I want to come back later on if there's an opportunity to talk about another, and I know Neville, also known as Ulrich, will speak about this, and that is the environmental security. If your Guyana is not environmentally secure, what are you developing? The issue of climate change, the issue of environmental security, we cannot take it for granted. I'm glad that Ulrich said that he's going to talk about that. So let me stop there and remind us that there's an implicit assumption about Guyana, which unless we consciously address, we will pass over, assuming that Guyana 2040 will be the Guyana we know now. If Venezuela has its way, they will not be 74% of this territory. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think that's a very sobering thought. When we think of Guyana, we think of our 83,000 square miles, but there is clear and present danger that 83,000 square miles could be in some meaningful way diminished. And as you rightly note, that amounts to that is a claim on 6 of the 10 regions of Guyana, and it is a claim on the fulcrum of Guyanese economics. And so, and it's interesting to note that in my reading of the plans, it's really good that you said that. It's my reading of the things that were there. So there, there's what I found in terms of references for preparing. So there's a kind of presentation by Stanley Ming, which it's a Guyana 2030 developmental vision for Guyana. There is the low carbon strategy, which I think is the thing that is extant right now, which is what we're broadly following. There's the green state development strategy, which I think was the strategy that was broadly articulated by the previous administration. And then there's an earlier national development strategy document, which I think of all of these is kind of the best. It is. I mean, if I were to offer my own, view on these various documents and their thought, I think somehow the national development strategy document is perhaps the best and most concrete and seems to make, but this was done in some very real way without oil. But I say all that to say that there was very little in these documents that go to the point that you made, which is there's very little, consideration of the fact that we could have quite less than 83,000 square miles. And so I think that's a good point. That's a good point to note. And I also think it's perhaps the right time to ask Ulrich to engage here, because as you rightly identify, the Venezuelan threat is an existential threat, and I have always thought that the other threat, which is that the water just jumps over the seawall and ends whatever's there, is the other really deep existential threat that Guyana faces. And so Dr. Tretz, perhaps you can elaborate on the environment as we look to and environmental strategies as we look to 2040, as we look to create some broad national development plan that has the kind of consistent consensus across the broad range of stakeholders.
Thank you, Terence, and take the opportunity to say hi to my fellow colleagues on the panel. I think IVLAW has given me an excellent entry point, because I am going to talk also now about the existential environmental threat that Guyana, not only Guyana, but the rest of the globe faces at this point in time. The environmental crisis that we face today is multifaceted and complex, and it encompasses not only climate change, but biodiversity loss, deforestation, pollution, and resource depletion. And it's a crisis that transcends national borders and affects every corner of the globe. And it threatens the very foundation of life as we know it. Now, a recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us that globally, if we continue on a business as usual trajectory, we will exceed the 1.5 degree centigrade warming threshold, which we all agreed was necessary if we were to avoid the consequences of runaway climate change. The Paris Agreement tells us that we should aim that by the end of the century, we would have seen the 1.5 as the maximum amount of heating of the planet. That report now tells us that in the period we're discussing, up to 2040, it is very likely, if we continue how we're developing, the world will achieve that 1.5 in this time frame. So the whole question of addressing this issue is critical, not only for us, but for the rest of the global community. In a way, fortunately, we have this low carbon development strategy, which addresses both how, as we move ahead global, with a global climate that is changing, we can pattern our development so that that is sustainable. And I want to go into a couple of specifics. I look at development as it's evolving in Guyana now, and my greatest concern is that we are not giving priority to some of the issues that are reflected in the LCDS. First and foremost, I think we need to secure the safety of our coastal population to whatever event is possible through a thorough mapping of our flood risk areas. Right now, Guyana is carrying out an extensive mapping of the country using the LIDAR technology, which can be utilized basically to identify along of our entire coast where we should build and where we shouldn't build. We need to have a thorough understanding of our flood risk zones. And as part of that, we need to use that information basically as our development proceeds and to develop, and I think Ivelaw, this is music to your ears, we need a contingency plan for relocation of communities in hazard zones. This is critical. And we have the facility to do it now. I think that should be at one of the top actions on our list in dealing with climate resilience. More importantly, I think it's important to integrate climate risk into any national development plan and to inculcate in the population and in all of everything we do a climate risk management ethic. That is, anytime you sit down to do anything about development, ask what the future climate is. This what I'm doing going to be secure with the climate of the future? When our drainage engineers sit down, normally they use historical rainfall patterns to inform the design of drainage. This is no longer viable. We have information available of future scenarios of rainfall. Our technical people need to be aware of this fount of information that would allow them to more or less integrate climate resilience into development plans. We need a very comprehensive drainage and irrigation and sea defense plan. This should be informed by a very comprehensive study of the entire Guyana coast. Better yet, if we could integrate this with Suriname, because everything that happens in our coast basically is dictated by what happens along that whole Guyana northern front. We need to understand the coastal sort of dynamics that dictate the pattern of accretion and erosion that is our biggest challenge in designing sea defense in Guyana. For infrastructure or roads, bridges, any other infrastructure must be built to specifications that would provide protection from extreme climate events, which are projected to be more intense and more frequent. Are all those contracts that are being given out, are those contractors, their actions informed by the risks that those developments face to future climate? One has to ask that question. We need to build capacity to monitor changes. A lot of monitoring systems in our interior to understand the flow of water across the coast. That would allow us basically to put in place early warning systems that would have us in a position to take proactive action uh, rather than this mode that we are in, which is recovery, recovery, recovery. We need to move out from that type of response mechanism. Now, of course, climate resilience across our agricultural sector, our health sector, infrastructure, everything must be informed by the type of climate information that we have available now about the future climate and what impact that would have on our existing environment. We there, these are just some examples of actions that are necessary if we are to cope with these challenges. Now, this is on the climate resilience, what we call adaptation side of the coin. The other important side of the coin has to do with phasing out the use of fossil fuels by 2050, which globally, that's our aspiration. And we plan to utilize carbon sequestration potential of our forests to access revenue from the global carbon market. In fact, Guyana has already started to put in place the necessary arrangements to access this market. And we also plan to monetize our ecosystem services other than carbon sequestration. And if this is to be successful, all efforts have to be made to ensure that our development is environmentally benign and takes place in such a way that the health of our watersheds, our wetlands, our mangroves, our forests are in no way compromised by development activities. This would require an adequate regulatory and supervisory system and one that is enforced. This will also require a well-equipped environmental protection agency with competent staff trained in relevant disciplines and functioning as an independent entity. Our ambition to develop an ecotourism industry, for instance, depends on the maintenance of a environment. And this is another reason why future development must not compromise its integrity. The Rupununi is one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. This arises from the constant succession of droughts and floods, a result of the unique hydrological regime in the area. To maintain this, it will be necessary to ensure that any development in the Rupununi, infrastructure, mega farms, hydroelectric facilities, do not disrupt this cycle. We have to learn to build with nature and not at its expense. The other side of the climate change coin has to do with phasing out of fossil fuels. And the LCDS speaks to this. In fact, the government has already embarked on the road to phase out fossil fuel use by 2050, the time frame agreed to in the Paris Agreement. There are enough resources in Guyana, Suriname Basin, and in Trinidad and Tobago to internalize the entire supply chain for the entire CARICOM to transition to the net zero status in the time frame designated by the Paris Agreement and not have to depend on outside sources. Example, a Petro-Carib agreement with Venezuela as a supplier. There are strong geopolitical, financial, and yes, environmental advantages to be gained by such an effort. The Green State Development Strategy, the LCDS, they have one thing in common: is about building climate resilience in the country as we develop, and of course, of phasing out fossil fuels. It's a document, and all the actions under the umbrella of these two documents basically is about our welfare. It's not about who wears red or who wears green to more or less signify which side of the political fence they are. It's about Guyanese survival, Guyanese prosperity, a Guyanese future. And I would hope that we could use the actions on the umbrella of these documents to get a more cohesive sort of approach to development, where all Guyanese are involved, where we all feel that we have a stake and that we can join hands across the political and ethnic divide that now separates us to really build resilience, a resilient and prosperous Guyana. And Vibert, I come back to this thing about continuity. And I think on reflection, now that I'm out of the climate center, we as regional institutions, when we go to governments with issues that are germane to national development, national interest, we slavishly speak to the government and to ministries. I think now we need to address parliaments and we need to involve the opposition and all concerned in our conversations so that we build that type of cohesion. So, regardless of which government is in power, we are all committed nationally to the action that we are trying to promote. I think I'll stop there, Terence.
I just lost my connection to the internet. The entire internet went down on my side, so I just actually dialed in on my. I just dialed in on my phone. So you have to. So there's certainly, infrastructure and connectivity is one of those issues that we want to be mindful of as we look to the future, and to have kind of in redundant infrastructure connectivity issues. But as I listen to you, Ulrich, articulate the real existential threats that emerge from the issues of the environment. It struck me that one of the challenges that we're facing here is a challenge of capacity. I mean, you've outlined an agenda. So for example, thinking through, how does the EPA become a much stronger and more robust regulatory organization that can do the kind of work that you've articulated? And it always seems to me that one of the places that we've had real difficulty understanding is this question of how to bring the Guyanese diaspora, how to bring the regional diaspora, how to bring our people home, so to speak, not to move home, but how to use their expertise from the perspective of home. And so, Lyra, I wanted to ask you to sort of, give us a sense of the diaspora in this context, and how we can think of the diaspora as contributing to what emerges in Guyana in another 15 or so years down the line.
Thank you, Terence. Can you hear me? Well,
yes, I can hear you fine. Yeah.
My colleagues have raised some very stark and sobering realities. What I will do is share some thoughts on diaspora engagement and how it may connect to national development in Guyana. I see the role of the diaspora in establishing vision for Guyana certainly be seen as very important, particularly with such a significant number of the population residing outside of the country. The diaspora can and has made contributions in a number of areas that are key to national development, I believe. I agree with Stanley Ming, whose article I read recently, who stated that Guyanese in the diaspora must not be treated as foreigners, but should be appreciated for their skills. And I would add their desire to give back while remaining emotionally attached to the country of their birth. I recently conducted a study of diaspora home country relationship with Dr. Leonard Lewis. And this research findings were presented at the second diaspora conference sponsored by the University of Guyana several months ago. We found in our research that indeed those in the diaspora are always welcomed back home by family and friends, but at times seem to be resented in some of the formal institutions, often due to differences in work acumen developed abroad, and even frustrated by bureaucratic flaws and discrimination. We found that a wide range of diaspora voluntary organizations, with over 400 of these hometown associations in North America alone, and business entities, have long been valued contributors to sustainable development in Guyana. These organizations have sought to maintain a working relationship with home country communities, as well as government and private institutions. Collectively, these interventions by the diaspora have contributed to economic growth. They have a strong track record in community development projects, healthcare services, providing schools with equipment and supplies for innovative educational programs, and funding scholarships. What about the impact of remittances on economic development? It was found that there is some relationship between remittances and government spending. Specifically, spending in healthcare and education, in healthcare and education sectors were positively affected. Two important questions I ask. Will the diaspora continue sending remittances at the same rate in light of the anticipated increased economic benefits from oil and gas sector? Secondly, if there's a significant increase in the number of Guyanese returning home, would there be criticism by locals who may have some resentment, you cut and run, we stand and bun? Two additional points must be raised. It was reported that approximately 89% of the tertiary education Guyanese immigrants have migrated. And secondly, Guyana has had a very high suicide rate. Have these affected economic growth in any way, I asked? In our research, we concluded that understanding the nuances of diaspora experience with philanthropy, expatriate property ownership, business investment, and participation in tourism are critical to the discourse in planning and development. It should be. On the question of how the diaspora can contribute to social strategies in development planning, we must have in place a well-organized diaspora engagement strategy. The Guyana diaspora wants to be engaged, but so far, the mechanism to make this a reality has not been realized. In order to ensure and sustain the diaspora contribution to development, a diaspora engagement strategy is imperative. It establishes the nation's policy and mechanism for a structured, reciprocal alliance with the diaspora. For more than a decade, Guyana government administrations have indicated an interest in establishing a conventional structure for engaging the diaspora. In 2017, the International Organization of Migration completed a comprehensive intervention report for a Guyana diaspora engagement strategy. Unfortunately, the strategy was never implemented. It is time for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to seriously augment mobilization of diaspora resources in various areas such as philanthropy, business, and education, all of which have substantial agency and much to offer. This would expand firm partnerships with overseas Guyanese who have expressed frustration over the issue of the diaspora engagement document. The future of the Guyana diaspora and how it is evolving. Our findings reassure that confidence and collaboration with the diaspora can improve the following: planning and project efficiency, public relations, development support communications, cultural production, and financial services. However, these should not be under local guidance. This should be under local guidance since they are closer to the action. The planned University of Guyana Development Studies program should focus on diaspora resourcefulness by conducting evidence-based research to better understanding its capacity, connections, and potential contribution. This would inform policy and strategy to build and sustain relationships between the diaspora and home. Although the IMF had urged the increase in the Guyana labor force through increased in-migration, there is an emerging phenomenon that perhaps needs more attention. Linking the effects of climate change to development plans, we must highlight the socio-economic and political impact of refugees and other immigrants. Many tend to settle in the hinterland, while most Guyanese occupy the coastline, perhaps becoming vulnerable to the ill effects of climate change. In this regard, in light of the anticipated social economic changes, development planning must be strategically managed. Furthermore, failure to streamline migration flows and temper fears and ambivalence of the local population could increase tensions, making evidence-based decisions difficult to achieve. I end with this. A few years ago, Guyana was described as one of the most impoverished countries, but is now ranked as one of the fastest growing economies, with some even touting the country as a future capitalist paradise. I thank you.
Well, I hope we soon, maybe we, well, I don't know if we want to be the future capitalist paradise in the sense that some people view the capitalism, but I think, Claire, you make some very important points, and I want to kind of pick up on this. You speak to the vital importance of the relationships between the diaspora and home. You speak to the way in which those relationships have been tempered by fear, that kind of mitigates against sort of evidence-based decisions about how can the diaspora affect planning? The question of this, how can we, help projects to be more effective, in areas like financial services? How can we help to manage some of these questions around immigration flows that are sort of key questions that are considered? And I really do. It's something I want to emphasize. It's something that we have in this particular program. We have thought very seriously, and we've tried to amplify. I was just reflecting two things as you were speaking. One, I remember you and I being at a program where I think it was Carl Greenwich who spoke, and some folks from Israel at York College many years ago on precisely this question of the diaspora engagement strategy. I remember the head of the diaspora engagement efforts now being on the very first program transforming Guyana, because this was clearly one of the things that we viewed as really vital and important. And I look now and I think, even in the context of this local effort, 2 years on, in the last kind of engagement, that there still is no kind of formal plan, and there and what one hears is sort of like, well, we want to, have the diaspora play a role in our broad national development strategy. But now, as we see it, even within the context of that national development strategy, as you were thinking, I was thinking, how did I recall reading something explicit in that strategy that spoke to the question of diaspora? And I could be wrong, but I don't think I read that in the Green State Development Strategy or in the earlier one. So this question of how we utilize our people and our resources, and in particular how we utilize the resources in the diaspora at this critical moment, I think is still an open one, and I hope that we can generate a bit of confidence in this regard. And as I look at the time, I want to sort of somehow shift, and I want to maybe piggyback on some of the questions that have been raised in the Q&A, and just kind of let you use that as a way to respond to issues that have emerged. So one of the first questions that came in as we were discussing this, and I thought maybe I'd start this with both Vibert and Ivelaw. This question came in from Randolph Williams. So it's like, as you talk about national development, maybe perhaps it's national competitiveness that we ought to be thinking about. And so perhaps, Ivelaw, could you potentially weigh in on the question of national competitiveness, and perhaps after that, Viper, can you kind of put this notion of competitiveness within the context of the broad cultural framework that you've outlined for us?
Thank you, Terence. And thank you to the person who posed the question. I don't see it as an either or, national development strategy or national competitive strategy. In the context of a modern society in the 2030s, even 2020s, given the limitations of Guyana as a national state, even with its oil, competitiveness has to be a desideratum for the national development strategy. But the competitiveness has a number of underlining elements to it. And those elements begin in part in the schools. You can't have an expectation of a competitive output if your input is subpar. And so the competitiveness as a desired outcome has to take into account the preparation at the various levels of the educational project. How are we gearing ourselves to be in whatever field of endeavor to maximize the opportunities for competitiveness? So I don't see it as a competitiveness strategy or national development strategy. For me, a necessity of any national development strategy in contemporary times has got to be to position ourselves to be competitive. If you're going to be in the oil sector, Competitiveness is a sine qua non. If you're going to be in the agricultural sector, whatever the arena of engagement, you've got to position yourself to be competitive, which means leveraging the skills and the capabilities necessary to be able to, using the national strategy that says, how are our policies aligned for competitiveness? How long does it take us to get from a product intent to product design to product development? So competitiveness to me is a necessary component of any national development strategy.
Vibert, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think Ivelaw has put us on the path. Competitiveness is also an attitude. It's also an attitude. You look at Jamaicans. We say Jamaicans are culturally confident, right? So competitiveness is also about attitude, and attitude influences behavior. So I take Ivor's point completely. Where do you start to nurture that? For example, competitiveness comes with play. And if we look at education life in Guyana now, the average child in primary school, and even those in secondary school, they've got reduced playtime. There is reduced playtime in Guyana. And it is on the playing field that we develop this an understanding of what competitiveness is. Competitiveness is also teamwork. There's individual brilliance, but there's also teamwork. I've all pointed out, the idea, the ideation, design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation. Competitive is systematic. So I totally agree with competitiveness is a desiderate. This is what you would expect from a nation that is functioning, where you're looking at your competitive advantages. Do we grow, peppercorns or very pepper? Who do we compete with? What's your market intelligence? As Larry is saying, it's evidence-based. It's not just pull it out of the air. Pull it out of the air, but base it on research. So, competitiveness is an integral part of going forward. I agree with Ivelaw. Started in the educational system. And as you go through the educational system, look at your pedagogy. How do you teach? Do we still teach top down? Okay, you're an empty cup. I've got all the wisdom. I'm going to pour it into you. Or do you have a much more, problem-based learning, where there's the problem solving, here the resource, so it's pedagogy, it is play, it is leisure time. What do we do with leisure? And we've got to be, Dave Martin once sang a song about copycats and copycatism. Competitors don't work with copycatism. And looking at some of the sectors in contemporary Guyanese society, copy, bringing in innovation, capture some early profits, and then move out of that. Not necessarily game for sustainable development. That's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. So one came in for you explicitly, Dr. Trotz. So which I know clearly you didn't mention. Elaborating on the role of the private sector in the management of the environment in Guyana. You did not kind of raise that in your and then looking specifically at the institution of Iwakrama and the Rainforest Project, and ways in which it could play a catalytic role, a broader role in the development possibilities.
The private sector. Now, we have always had a challenge with the private sector in getting them on board for action on the one aspect of the climate change umbrella, that is building climate resilience. And let me explain that. The reason for that is that adaptation, building climate resilience, the output is usually a public good. Restoring our mangroves, basically shoring up our sea defense, uh, drainage and irrigation. These are actions that redound to the benefit of the community and not to a specific uh, entity, so to speak. So we have always had a challenge of getting private sector investment in that type of activity, which is critical. Getting them to basically help us populate the country with measurement instruments for meteorological purposes, etc. So this usually falls on a government budget, and this is why there is such a lag in terms of implementing that type of necessary action. And this is why we go to the international community, basically to saying that we need climate finances to address this aspect of our response to climate change. The other part of it has to do with the energy transition. And there, the private sector is very much on board because the investment that is required, it's basically provides them with returns. So we're seeing a lot of leadership in the private sector in sort of moving over to moving away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, because in the final analysis, that redounds to their profitability and basically to their own personal welfare. So the private sector is very much on board with the energy transition. We did some work in a big hotel complex dealing with the issue of water to get them to put in a very extensive water harvesting system, which would allow them basically to use that water for the swimming pools, etc., and recycling all of the wastewater, which they use to water their 18-hole golf course. When they realize that by doing that, the money they had to pay to the utilities basically for water was reduced by about 80% of what they were paying, they were very quick to put their own investment into more or less speeding out that activity. So for the private sector, it's about how does it, uh, unless, of course, you have the exception, those with a lot of resources and who have an altruistic turn of mind to sort of support actions that would redound to the community's benefit. But the private sector, as I said, has been a challenge in the climate resilience side in the umbrella, but they are very much on board with the energy transition aspect of our responses to climate change. As for Iwakrama, I of course have been associated with Iwakrama from its very beginning. I'm proud to say, and it right now, particularly when we are looking at management of our forestry estate, management of the Guyana Shield, I think Iwakrama is a very important institution. The carbon credit program, the ambition of the government to monetize ecosystem services, the the sort of benefit we could get from managing our biodiversity and looking at value added from our medicinal plants, for instance, etc. The whole issue about our indigenous population and their relationship to the forestry estate, all those issues, I think Iwakrama are in an excellent position institutionally to give the Guyana the guidance in which to deal with these evolving issues.
Oh, thank you. I think you just raised a very, the thought that occurred to me while you were, I had a thought, how is the budget of Iroquois? Would you know, how is the budget grown or not grown as a over the time that we have, moved from budgets that we've moved to budgets that are now being influenced by our oil and gas resources? I mean, has there been a significant investment in there, or
I,
pretty much the same, or you don't know? Yeah.
well, I think there has been an investment by Exxon in some of Ivo Kramer's work, but not Ivo Kramer, unfortunately, when originally conceived, it was to have evolved into an international center with support basically coming through the aegis of the Commonwealth Secretariat. It was a Commonwealth initiative. Unfortunately, the international finance did not flow. And Ivo Kramer has not been able to realize its full potential simply because of the fact that it hasn't really been able to get the type of financial support that is necessary. Recently, we had the this agreement which the Brazilians led that basically calls for institutions like Iwokrama and across the entire Amazon basin to have a collaborative arrangement, basically to address all of the issues dealing with the management of that Amazon ecosystem. I think this is a great opportunity for looking for new avenues of support, but it's an important institution, and I would hope that with the resources now being available to government, that they would see Ukrama as one of the institutions that needs their full support.
Thank you. So, Lear, this one has popped in especially for you. So so Peter Ramreka sort of notes that the so there is, so how do you optimize, and so maybe I want to give you a few more minutes to, so you've talked about the research saying that you've noted that perhaps the diaspora engagement can help with planning. It can make projects more efficient in financial services. So the question here, I suppose, is around when you talked about tempering fears. And so what's the optimal place? I mean, like if you wanted to say, here are two things that we have to do. So as we move to 2040, we begin to better harvest the expertise of our diaspora around the world. How do we optimize? So there's a need to determine how best for the diaspora to be able to contribute without appearing to threaten, the professional, or to threaten the professionals in Guyana. I mean, I think you made this point perhaps implicitly when you spoke about tempering fears. On the positive side, how do we think about that?
Well, one of the problems is that there's so much mistrust because of the history of Guyana in terms of ethnic relations. A lot of the fears are related to not trusting the government and not working with other groups, even within the diaspora. We can see separation between ethnic groups. We can see that there's, I think another thing is that there should be a common vision. And that's something that I think is lacking in terms of how forceful or how impactful the diaspora can be in terms of contributing to development. It's as if groups are doing their own thing in their own communities, rather than collectively. And when you really look at it, there's a common goal of helping to develop Guyana, the interest in connecting to Guyana, So I think it has to do with common vision, not trusting, a non-trusting attitude, which has been, traditional, and how to break through that. It can be very difficult. Another thing that we have to look at is how interested or how connected is the coming generation of Guyanese. There's a disconnect between the Guyanese who were born in the diaspora and the older quote unquote Guyanese who are more connected. And this is not unusual in any diaspora relationship with other countries. But these are the issues that would affect the way in which the diaspora can be as a collective impactful on development in Guyana.
Yeah. So as you spoke, I mean, one of the issues this sort of question came in, and so I think I can respond to this in a way, sort of what is the strategy to educate the diaspora about Guyana, its business opportunities, and so on. I mean, in a sense, this was part of one of the animating forces behind the Business Journal and behind the Navigating the Changing Guyana, where we wanted to go out and kind of find folks and kind of bring them into various groupings, education, health, etc. And hopefully we will still continue to do this. But this is actually a very long-term project, and it is a project which I think has really been impacted in some ways by the sort of thing that you've described, which is the need to have some kind of reciprocal engagement at the level of the technical government structure, and not necessarily at the level of the political dynamics, but understanding that this is part of your broader development strategy to engage your diaspora. And so there's a kind of place that is set up for this, so that regardless of the political dynamic at a moment, that the people who are the technical people can continue to work in figuring out how to do it. So I just wanted to respond to Melvin on that one. Now, this is actually a better way to conduct this thing somehow, because I've just looked up and realized that I'm already at 11:52. So my apologies. I just aim to keep you. I'm just going to go with two more questions, and maybe just one more. I'll put both of them on the screen, and you can use them as a way to. It's 52, so 4 times 2, that's 8. So that gets us to noon, which I know is a kind of break point. So the two questions that I'm going to use at the end. So future looking. So first one from Randolph Campbell. So question for the entire panel. Sort of thinking through how the forum can assist in the establishment of the organizational capacity for development planning. I often think that, when in moments when I'm critical of Guyana, I think that, often you have a group that consists of like 20 people or 15 people, and it's just simply not enough. I remember once being at the Marriott Hotel, and I saw someone come in to have, on the basis of oil companies, come in to have negotiations with some of our senior people. And there was just one person from our side. And then on the other side of the table, there was a huge army. And I thought, it doesn't matter how smart you are. There's no way that one really smart person can engage 30 really smart people and come out of that. So structurally, it's bad. And so somehow, I like this question of thinking, give a thought on how we can, do like the state of Israel. Establish a team of 180 professionals across various sectors to create some sort of blueprint for our nation's development future, and maybe think a little further along on planning and restructuring of the national economy that makes sense. So I'll give you, so perhaps in order, maybe Vibert, and then Lear, and then Ivlaw, and then Ulrich.
Thanks. Very quickly, the development planning, strategic planning, we must bring communication to the table. Invariably, development plans call in the communication practitioners after they develop the plan. And 180 professionals or 200 professionals, if there's no communication sensitivity to the planning discourse, we're getting through another top-down kind of area. So development planning must include communication specialists. And I recall the name Victor Forsyth, the founder of the Center for Communication Studies at the University of Guyana in the 1970s. And that was motivated by a concept called development support communication. And I would want to suggest that we incorporate that as it's a profession, it's a career that is crucial. It is strategic. So it deals with problem identification. What is it we are looking at? The evidence-based approach. What methods we use to identify that. Design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation is a systemic and creative process. And until development planners recognize that communication, as Forsyth says, if we are all a community of staves, we need some hoops to make the barrel. The communication is the hoop that brings all the staves together to create that vessel that provides the water, the nutrition, or whatever it is for the society. So my long-winded answer is, sure, a national strategy for development planning that's separate, but in that team must be communication professionals. And in Guyana, that should not be a strange thing, because we were among the pioneers in the region discussing and implementing this practice called development support communication, communication support, C4D, and all of these terms. But it is about the importance of communication, not just media, communication, interpersonal, organizational. That's my contribution.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to add this one so there's also a question of, the external development banks. So in addition to those two, so Lair, if you want to offer a thought there.
Yeah, I agree with Vibert in terms of the importance of communication. But it is also important to think or design communication that penetrates the entire society. Communication at community level.
Yeah.
Very important, because oftentimes communication is not done in a holistic way.
Not in professional communication for development studies.
Right. Okay. Exactly. So and so one of the things I will close with this. I attended a virtual conference that UG held, sponsored by UG, about 5 months ago, and there were people from the Essequibo region, and the theme of the conference was do not fear, prepare, don't fear, prepare rather than fear. And there was this woman in the audience who raised the question about how can we prepare? What is the government offering us? What assistance they're helping us in this preparation? And there was a government communication person on the panel, and he said, all you need to do is, go to the internet. The internet provides a lot of information. We have a lot of information about what to do, so to calm your fears. The woman calmly said, "Sir, where I'm from, we have cast net, we have fish net, and we have mosquito net, but we don't have internet." The meeting ended. So I leave you with that.
Professor Griffith, Castnet, Fishnet, Internet, but maybe we want the team of professionals with a communication person in it to give us a blueprint that kind of all of the stakeholders can be a part of for the future, so that we don't miss this moment. What are your thoughts?
Vibert's reference to Victor Forsyth brought back memories. Victor used to kill us with that barrel all the time. He said, "Man, put away the barrel." Victor, put the barrel aside, man. He said, "What the barrel is central." I want to come back in my 1 minute commentary to an elephant in the room that Lair mentioned en passant, and that is the issue of trust. The issue of trust is going to be a perennial issue unless there is a studious, conscious effort to engage the diaspora with a manifest intent to reduce the political and the racial dynamic. The onus has to come from Georgetown, not the government only, but from the national leadership, meaning opposition parties, to say we want to engage the diaspora not on a partisan, racial, political level, but on a national level. We want to, for example, collect the database of skills, not only of some people, but of all Guyanese who are interested in. Unless there's a conscious effort to deal with that elephant in the room, the politics and the race, some of which is aggravated in the diaspora, some of which is used deliberately around elect. You see the next couple of months in New York, for example, where I live, you're going to have a whole lot of diaspora dynamics related to the impending elections. Those dynamics are going to put a damper on some diaspora engagement for a while, because it's going to be tinged with partisanship, it's going to be tinged with race, and it's going to undermine any intent to collectively, substantively engage the diaspora.
Yeah, I mean that elephant is one that is indeed there in the room, and it's one that I think, and in some sense, I think this is what I hope. Right? It's that our actions here, given the sort of experiences that we have, that they don't become exacerbating factors within the context of home. That somehow the example here, and I think maybe I'm a bit naive, as you have pointed out, there is this increasingly there is the polarization of home has become the polarization of the diaspora, and I've always hoped that the ability of the diaspora to work together can be an example to be emulated within the context of home. Am I crazy in assuming that we can get there in 15 or 20 years? So I'll give you the last word, Dr. Ulrich Strauss. And I noted, did you want to have a final comment, Viber? Dr.
I just wanted to point out that in terms of the 15-year, there's a glimmer. This Guyana Cultural Association of New York has transcended in many ways the ethnic drama in Guyana. And I find that when you do the work that we have done through methods like co-discovery of commonalities, co-creation of programs, you begin to build in a small way, to use my Nigerian self, we begin to develop trust. So you got to look at the points where trust is nurtured. And I think it's in the cultural sphere, in dance, in music, in cuisine. So, yeah, major problem, but there are also these little glimmers that we should think. And I'm very proud of the work that Guyana Cultural Association of New York has done and continues to do.
Plus, you get the final word.
I have to end on this note about utilizing diaspora skills, because I've had a whole set of my old students who've done exceptionally well outside, and they keep asking me how can they make a contribution. I think three things are required. First, intent. There must be a clear intent of the government that they are going to utilize the diaspora skills wherever it's available. The second is information. Whichever institution in Guyana is responsible for recruiting diaspora, they must have a comprehensive list of skills across the entire development landscape that are required. And this must be matched by an inventory of skills held by our embassies and consulates across the globe, so that you can match requirements to skills available. And this way, basically, I hope, apart from everything else, that a greater advantage, would be taken in terms of utilizing diaspora skills. I've always felt that the university, for instance, this long summer break that all of our academics in the diaspora have in their institutions, we really should have that as a busy semester in Guyana that would allow diaspora academics to be in Georgetown and Guyana, making a contribution to a vibrant summer program. We have to look for opportunities for thinking outside the box. But I think that this is where we have a core of skills that are relevant to our development, and that we should make every effort to make sure that these skills, if available, are utilized.
I agree.
Well, colleagues, I want to thank you, and maybe just to share a short note. My thesis advisor, Indian national named Ravi Kulkarni, he took me in the year 2000 to the place called the Harish Chandra Research Institute in Allahabad in India. And what I discovered there was precisely a program that you've just described, which is a large number of the Indian academics would be there at the institute during the course of the summer, teaching courses on all of the various areas that they were teaching. So you had faculty members from Princeton, from Harvard, from the City University of New York, from Australia, from London, all playing a vital role in seminars for advanced high school students, undergraduate students, graduate students. And so I think that certainly is a model that is there, and it does not require a lot. And I would also say too, just as a note, not to put Ivel on the spot, but during his time at the University of Guyana, we actually did one math summer institute where we worked with teachers and undergraduate math majors in at the university. So, but something like that is not very difficult, and I would certainly hope that, to Vibert's point, that's a small seed that you can nurture in terms of just the transfer of expertise from the West to Guyana, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. Having said that, I realize I've kept you beyond 12. It's 7 minutes after, and so let me just thank you and thank all the people who've joined us. This has been an excellent conversation. I actually think that as we go forward, this conversation will set the tone for the subtopics that go over the course of the year. And so I want to thank you for, in a sense, creating this agenda for us around sustainable and economic growth, diversification, education reform, workforce development. I've been making notes, infrastructure, smart cities, moving the capital someplace, climate adaptation, biodiversity conservation, and good governance. And so regional integration, that was the last one I noted. And so thank you folks all, and I look forward to us doing this again in the not too distant future. And thank you again to the audience.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
All right, you too.
Thank you again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one.